Hello. I was kind of in a mood tonight to chat a little bit about one of my favorite subgenres. It's become a huge subgenre of board games and tabletop games. But it started as short stories, by the early 20th century author HP Lovecraft. He wrote about cosmic horror and about horror that came not from perhaps a scary monster behind the closet or some vampire. Even though it has those elements too, H.P. Lovecraft wrote about cosmic horror. The idea that there were forces so powerful, so uncaring and callous and malevolent toward humans, that they would see us as the way we look at ants, so small and insignificant that they either held us in contempt or they didn't care about us one way or the other. The outer gods. He created a mythos. It's called the Mythos. It's his mythology. And it's really the best horror mythology that there is. I heard someone describe it as the atheist's worst nightmare, in the sense that God is real, gods are real, but they either don't care about you, or they hate you, or in some cases, they enjoy toying with you. So in many of Lovecraft's stories, there are creative, sensitive type characters, or sometimes scientists or artists, who find themselves discovering truths about the universe and the cosmos, and learning that there are forces unseen that really don't care about humans, that are sometimes trying to eke their way into our world, and in some cases are already here, and in other cases are so large or powerful or beyond our understanding that they don't even have consideration for humanity or for Earth. Lovecraft's mythos had a way of combining science fiction with horror, with fantasy, because there are aliens essentially, but there are also demons and ghosts in some senses. And in many cases, the demons and the ghosts and the aliens are all the same. At the center of the cosmos in this mythos is Azathoth, the blind idiot god, the dreamer, who at the center of all creation dreams with a chorus, a symphony of demons playing flutes around him. It's really wild. And he's the greatest of the outer gods, and yet perhaps the least self-aware. Then there are also great old ones, creatures that are far less powerful, than outer gods, perhaps far smaller. If words like big or small can mean anything, perhaps these are more mortal. If words like mortal or immortal can mean anything, and the great old ones have a lot in common with the outer gods sometimes. Sometimes they serve them. Sometimes they seem to be against them. Sometimes they seem to descend from them. Other times they seem to be against them or uncaring about them. But it's perhaps notable that the great old ones often seem to care or have more interest in humanity than the outer gods do. The most well-known of the great old ones is Cthulhu. Cthulhu, who sleeps in the sunken city of R'lyeh, believed to be underneath our very oceans, and when the stars are right, he will awaken, and he will arise, and in the meantime, as he sleeps, he calls out to some individuals, filling their mind with images and thoughts, visions and madness. So an ongoing theme in HP Lovecraft's work is the idea that there are some truths you can discover about yourself, about the world, and especially about the universe, that are so disturbing or impossible to comprehend that they will cause you to either go insane from terror or simply go directly insane from trying to comprehend what you've witnessed or experienced or seen or tried to understand. The idea of knowledge leading to insanity is a wonderful and common theme in Lovecraft's works. Now, there's other people who have described HP Lovecraft's Mythos wonderfully well, and I do recommend them. There's a wonderful documentary called Fear of the Unknown about HP Lovecraft. I encourage you to check it out. But Lovecraft died young, and he died penniless, and he died alone after a sad, anxious, lonely life. But I don't think he realized just how influential his works would become. And because his stories quickly found themselves into the public domain, before too long, they became the subject of tabletop games, role-playing games, card games, and board games, of which there are many, many, many. I've played a huge percentage of them, and yet I know that there are that many more. Some are quite wonderful. Many are forgettable. Some are terrible. And several are wonderful. Now, in my little description of HP Lovecraft's Mythos, I didn't fully do justice describing it. In some ways, I may have mischaracterized his mythology. In other cases, I may have just left too much out, oversimplified it. The mythology itself is supposed to be something we can't really understand. But as I've heard it described, it's a kind of world, it's a kind of universe, a kind of mythology that you can't really make a game about in the pure sense. And here's why. Because in Lovecraft's mythos, there really is no fighting back. There's no stopping the darkness, the chaos, and the evil, to the extent words like good or evil can mean anything in this mythos that is sometimes about good versus evil, but other times completely amoral. This is well known, so people are often very dissatisfied by games where you play as a fighter or an investigator, and you have a chance to fight the monsters that are arising because of the awakening of great old ones or the summoning and arrival of an outer god. And people often find this to be somewhat unsatisfying because I suppose they think that to be true to Lovecraft, your characters should start terrified and helpless and end terrified and helpless without anything else in between except the progression of that and the further realization that we are all doomed. So as part of my namesake on this channel, I chose Eldritch. It's a wonderful word. Eldritch relates to a meaning that means something that's sort of alien, foreign, disturbing, creaturely, monstrous, grotesque, weird, strange, ghostly, indescribable, or just very, very odd. It's not a good definition, but you would hear Lovecraft saying, "It was an eldritch thing." So I love the name, the word eldritch, and it's also in the title of one of my favorite board games that is inspired by the so-called Cthulhu mythos, Lovecraft's mythos. And that board game is Eldritch Horror. Eldritch Horror is one of my favorite games ever made. And in order to understand why, I need to take a step back again. Lovecraft was very much an anxious, furtive, paranoid man in many ways. An absolute genius, but a furtive and terrified soul. His attitude toward the creatures and beings and entities of the mythos, I believe, are in some ways meant to be intended, or just by consequence not intended, his own subjective response to if those were real. But not everyone maybe would respond that way. even if they started to go insane in the process, perhaps they wouldn't be as terrified. So there are some challenges that we can offer to people who say it makes no sense to have a board game or a video game where you can fight back against the evil. The first such challenge is to say, alright, look, we know that we love the Cthulhu mythos, we love Lovecraft's cosmos, his universe. How beautifully horrifying it is, how there's mystery behind every corner, how there's an unseen world of impossible geometry just beyond our own. We love all of that. And we love the sense of dread, the fear of the unknown, and the helplessness. It at once completely rips out our soul, but the defeat and nihilism of it in darker moments can be strangely reassuring in the darkest sense. But if we love these things, if it is to be said that a board game or a video game could be based on these at all, it must be allowed to have some tweaking, some adjusting to make it more fun as a game, to make it at least possible to play, at least possible to win. Perhaps there will be more sad endings than happy, perhaps even the happy endings of that game, successfully completing the mission or the quest, would ultimately lead to an even greater tragedy, or a side tragedy that was unforeseeable. But it must still be including something that's doable, accomplishable. If someone just outright rejects the notion that any video game or board game can be based on Lovecraft's mythos, well, then perhaps there's nothing for it. They've already prejudged. And I'm not blaming them, that's their right. But for those of us who think it's alright to modify it a little bit, to make it so that even though it's mostly hopeless, there's that glimmer of hope against hope, even if it comes sandwiched in tragedy and disgust and apparition. For the rest of us who don't outright reject the notion of a Lovecraft-inspired board game or video game, then we can have a conversation. That's the first part. The second part is that things may not always have been as hopeless in Lovecraft's universe as Lovecraft himself describes. I mentioned how he was especially furtive, defeatist, fearful, perhaps even nihilistic in some ways. But I will also add that if Azathoth suddenly decided to descend his energy upon Earth, sure, there would be no stopping it. We would be truly helpless. But not everything in the Lovecraft universe that's menacing or threatening is as strong or powerful as Azathoth. So, keep in mind that the Dunwich Horror, who was a child of Yog-Sothoth, Yog-Sothoth being perhaps second or third or fourth most powerful, if we can even try to gauge or measure power, and if it means anything. But Yog-Sothoth is one of the most powerful entities in the Lovecraftian universe, and perhaps much more self-aware than Azathoth, with perhaps much more interest in humanity. He does, after all, impregnate a human woman. So, this isn't exactly an entity that's beyond completely having interest in humanity. So this child of Yog-Sothoth, known only as the Dunwich Horror, keep in mind that through the use of humans gathering together, discovering the lore they needed, using effectively chemistry and magic and spells, they were able to defeat the Dunwich Horror. The Dunwich Horror, I believe, certainly still qualifies as a great old one, even if not an outer god. So to anyone who says that no great creature or entity or being in the Lovecraftian cosmos could ever be slowed down or stopped by human hands, read the Dunwich Horror. The most famous of Lovecraft's stories is probably the Call of Cthulhu. Now, some spoilers abide here, of course. Already there have been, forgive me. But we know that Cthulhu, even if he was in a recently awoken stage, even if he was perhaps weakened, not in his full glory, and even if perhaps it didn't hurt him that much, but simply stunned him or temporarily paralyzed him, even if on some level he let it happen a little or was pulling his punches in a way, we do know that a ship built by humans, manned by humans, ramming into Cthulhu was able to hurt him. So this giant beast, Cthulhu, this great old one, with power beyond power, again, he's much less powerful than Azathoth, but he's still so powerful that he can, just through psychic connection and telepathy, draw hordes of cultists and followers worshipping him and willing to kill and sacrifice and mutilate themselves in his name and revel in gore and an orgy of bloodshed and chaos. Despite all his power, he can be physically harmed by humans, at least in some capacity. So it's simply not true to say that there aren't any great beings in the Lovecraftian mythos that can be harmed by humans. Now, all of that being said, there's still only hints, small little suggestions of ways that we could fight back or hold back the darkness just a little bit. But that's what I like with the board game publisher Fantasy Flight Games. Of all of the Cthulhu, Mythos, Lovecraftian board games, theirs are perhaps the most famous and well-known and well-liked in general. The first one to become truly popular was Arkham Horror. The second edition became a huge cult hit and eventually extremely mainstream in the board game community. And the third edition, which quite overhauls it and changes it a lot, and many people perhaps might even prefer, we'll see. That's come out recently. Since Arkham Horror, Fantasy Flight Games has made a number of different Lovecraft and Cthulhu-inspired board games that feature many original characters made by Fantasy Flight Games. So instead of simply making a Lovecraft board game, they made a Lovecraft Plus universe, which means that the Fantasy Flight universe, the Fantasy Flight Games version of Lovecraft Mythos, which is sometimes called the Arkham Horror universe or Arkham Horror Files, has persistent, overlapping characters that Fantasy Flight Games created, as well as original ideas that aren't really in the Lovecraft mythos, such as gates to other worlds popping up all over town or all over the world, and evil creatures flowing in from them. And the more gates there are open, the more close we are to the Great Old One or Outer God, about to destroy, take over, ruin, or absorb the world or universe. A lot of original ideas that are only hinted at in Lovecraft's writings, Fantasy Flight Games took and borrowed from and extended and expanded, and took what was almost a hopeless sense of dread in cosmic horror set in the 1920s when Lovecraft wrote, and expanded it into horror, mythology, Lovecraftian dread, but with a little bit of hopeful action, a little bit of a spirit of adventure, a little bit of fighting back against the darkness, or at least delaying it, at least holding it back. So even if you don't think the Lovecraft mythos can be turned into a board game, you have to accept or at least respect the notion that the Fantasy Flight Games universe of Arkham Horror Files is not meant to be an exact manifestation through game of that. It's meant to be their take on it. It's a new universe. It's become its own thing. It's become a cousin of the original mythos. And even if tragedy constantly occurs and adventurers and investigators go mad, get broken legs, become poisoned, get amnesia, get tortured, see horrible visions, find out terrible truths that cause them to lose all connection with humanity or become lost in time and space, and so on and so on and so on. Even with all that, there's still a sense of we at least have a chance to fight, and we must. And with Eldritch Horror in particular, which takes place across the entire map of the world in the 1920s, with gates popping up all over, with monsters appearing here and there, great old ones sometimes appearing and doing everything we can to gain clues, solve puzzles, fight evil, solve mysteries, and stop the great old one or outer god from entering into our world. This is the core of the game, which mixes that hopeless Lovecraftian dread with almost an Indiana Jones style adventure smeared with a film noir aesthetic. The combination sounds like it shouldn't work, and I'm sure many people don't like it, but for me it works wonderfully. And there's really no better sense of horror adventure, in my view, than the Fantasy Flight games, board games of Eldritch Horror and Mansions of Madness, both first edition and, for me, actually, the second edition even more. I own everything for both, and I adore them. And there is a fun sense of wonder, a sense of menace that lends itself to a grim smile, a bit of gallows humor, a sprinkle of insanity, a hint of dread, a broken arm or broken leg, or a collapsed lung or two, or a parasite crawling through your brain as your friend tries to cure you with a spell but can't find exactly the right runes or combinations, or becomes lost somewhere in Antarctica, freezing to death, discovering ancient cities by long-lost alien demonic species that were here long before humanity. This is the fun of the Arkham horror universe, the Arkham Files universe, the Eldritch Horror universe and world and game. And I give so much credit to Fantasy Flight Games and Corey Konechka and Kevin Wilson and especially Nikki Valens. Forgive me, there's a cat here. Hey, honey. A little later. Sorry, just a moment as I try to fix what my cat did to my keyboard, but I think it's okay. There we go. Sorry about that. Owning cats is wonderful. Lovecraft loved them too, and yet they can be quite an issue when you're trying to play board games. Eldritch Horror is perhaps my favorite of the Lovecraftian board games because of the richness of depth, the sheer variety of things that can happen, the way the story unfolds differently every time, the sense of progression and the sense of regression and tragedy and failure, which happens more often than success, and the wonderful aesthetic of tentacled, intergalactic or underwater or deep in a cavern creatures and monsters and hideous beings covered in ichor and grotesque growths. To me, these games still feel like they capture enough of the spirit of Lovecraft, but still add enough adventure and fun that they are not too much compromise. It is a good balance for a game. They are fun to play. Now, I do feel that Arkham Horror 2nd Edition is too long for what it is, even though I know many people love it. Likewise, even though I used to own everything for it, I do feel that Elder Sign, which is a dice-based Lovecraftian game in the Arkham Horror universe, is actually too long and complicated for how simple the core dice mechanism is. Meanwhile, many other Lovecraftian games made by other companies are often not as good or are gimmicky. The game called Mansions of Madness by Yellow is apparently quite fun and interesting and worthwhile to play, but it won't really capture the spirit, the breadth, the largeness of the Cthulhu mythos as I'm describing. When it comes to Lovecraft, I think what really, among other things, sets him apart from other authors and world builders is the sheer scope of the tapestry he was building. Universe upon universe, multiverse, gigantic creatures beyond understanding, other dimensions, other planets, dreamlands, portals, deep caverns underneath the pyramids of Egypt. All of these things. There's less of a single focus, like Edgar Allan Poe, and more of an overwhelming explosion of horrific scope and information. And therefore, I think the best way to represent this is with a game that shares a similar scope, which is often why people will like Arkham Horror. It does have that sense of scope to a large degree, especially with the expansions, but it's easily 6 or 8 hours or more to play, perhaps 4 with only seasoned players. It's very long, much more convoluted and complicated. Now, Eldritch Horror is no incredibly simple game. Eventually, when you play with seasoned players, then you play with the correct amount of urgency that you should with a board game, rather than analysis paralysis, like lame people would do. As long as you do that all, the game can be 2 or 3 hours. On your first game, first several, or if you're playing with new people, it is likely it will be at least 4 or 5 hours. But it will not be 6 or 8 hours, and it will be easier to remember. The than Arkham Horror. They come together a bit more seamlessly. They're a bit more intuitive. And the scope of Eldritch Horror is over the entire world, rather than only the city of Arkham, even though Arkham itself, the fictional town in Massachusetts that Lovecraft created, the namesake since the inspiration for Arkham Asylum and Batman, especially since the town of Arkham in Lovecraft's writings did indeed have an asylum also. This is part of the fictional landscape of Arkham Country, which also includes Dunwich, the rural farming village, Kingsport, and Innsmouth, the eerie, dying port town with a dark secret. Shadow over Innsmouth is one of my favorite stories. So, if you're just looking to get into a good Lovecraftian board game that still has a lot of theme and flavor, and comes to life, but is not overcomplicated, isn't over long, but still captures all the feelings you want in an Arkham Files universe, I recommend Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition. I know it's weird that it uses an app that you need to put on a laptop or a phone or a tablet while you play. But it's free, the app, and it works so well. And it really makes the game pop and work for this. If you're not sure about getting a Lovecraftian themed inspired board game, I highly recommend Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition for anyone on the fence. It's easier to start biting off immediately than Eldritch Horror, and much more thematic and immersive than Elder Sign, or so many others for that matter. I'll always love the Lovecraftian mythos, and admire Lovecraft and his genius despite his many horrible flaws as a human being, as we all can have. And not only because it's my namesake, but because it's a passion of mine, I will often talk about Lovecraft and his mythos and inspiration that I've taken from it and others have, and the board games that I especially love, both the cosmic horror ones inspired by Lovecraft and more gothic or traditional colonial American horror, like A Touch of Evil, the Sleepy Hollow inspired board game that also celebrates Universal movie monsters in general, and a kind of New England colonial, late Victorian, or early Victorian perhaps, sense of gothic mystery and horror. Perhaps part of the reason why we like horror games so much is the sense of mystery and exploration. Now in Eldritch Horror, the map never changes, because it's a map of the world. But sometimes gates will appear, monsters will move, you'll find a clue somewhere, an artifact will appear, a rumor will show up, and effectively different things move all around the world. With Mansions of Madness, there is the literal exploration of putting down new room tiles, because just as eldritch horror is the most zoomed out and encapsulates the whole of the world, and sometimes more, especially with gates or sideboards from some big box expansions, Mansions of Madness is highly zoomed in, almost a fully cooperative dungeon crawl, room by room, space by space, opening bookshelves, looking under tables, trying to put back pieces of a map together, gathering evidence, solving riddles, and fighting a monster that smashes through a doorway, or trying to run away from it and pushing a bookshelf behind you to block the way. The fun and adventure and mystery and horror and immersive storytelling nature of these games can't be understated. So they'll always have a special place in my heart, and I'll always love to talk about them. There's something to be said for stories, media, games, music, art, books, movies, films, whatever, that remind us of the darkest parts of existence, the darkest possible depths of despair and tragedy. Perhaps in some way it's cathartic, or perhaps in another way, by keeping it front-loaded on our hard drive, it makes us a little bit more prepared, a little bit more accepting when these dark moments strike our own lives in their own way. Sometimes there's room for everything that's not beautiful. Not to remind us that everything's not beautiful, we already know. But to keep us accustomed, to keep us just the right amount of hardened. I'm checking a lot of things at once here as I do this video, and if you made it this far, even if you didn't, I want to really thank you for taking the time to listen to this or watch. I know that I'm not very good at these ASMR videos yet, but the works of others have been of a huge benefit to me and inspiration for me. I know I'm a bit awkward with my presentation style and my mannerisms, but I'm working on it. But this is one weirdo who really does appreciate you stopping by to chat with me a little bit about some things that I find fascinating and am passionate about. As always, if you want, if you feel like, leave a like, a subscribe, a comment, a share, a notification bell. 1 or 2 of those, 3 or 4, or none, whatever you want. And I will see you all very, very soon.